Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this experiment in live-streamed roundtabling, otherwise known as Rory and Stanley play talk show hosts for an hour or so. It's a delight to have you here. It's a very great pleasure for us and a great honor to have the assembled on this stage this afternoon. What we'd like to do is have, again, a very informal and fluid discussion. There have been a number of themes and issues and very pregnant, profound questions being asked today about reconciliation, about the function of history in contemporary Polish-Ukrainian relations. So we have a lot to discuss, and we want to enable all of you to have an opportunity to participate. We'll also be joined by numerous colleagues and individuals online who will be sending questions and participating in the discussion as well. Again, we'll keep it fluid and open-ended. I want to begin with a question posed by a great colleague of ours, Mark von Hagen, who is professor of history at Arizona State University. He sadly could not be here, but wanted to make sure he was here not only in spirit, but also in conversation with you. And he asked the following question: what have the political and intellectual elites of Poland and Ukraine learned from 20th century histories? To what degree have Poles transcended Pilsudski's ideas about Ukraine's place in Poland's history? And to what degree have Ukrainians proved capable of transcending their historical mistrust of the Poles? Since it's a challenge to know to whom to direct a question like that, given that it's a very big one, I'm going to just err on the side of proximity and ask Mykola Grabczuk to attempt an answer, to get the conversation started. Mykola?
Well, I wouldn't respond for Polish elite, because I don't belong, and I don't want to take this, piece of bread from my Polish colleagues. As to Ukrainians, I feel that in this regard, Ukraine is very different, because we have. In this case, I hope that Jarosław Rysak wouldn't oppose me. In this case, we really have two Ukraines, because we have one part where Polish-Ukrainian conflicts and problems is not an issue. And the other part where it's really hot topic still is a hot topic, because it's still a part of family memory and so on. I mean, in Western Ukraine. So of course, perception is very different. I would say that in major part of Ukraine, Poland is just a neighbor, or maybe the neighbor, because it's the most visible neighbor which is present in mass media, which has very positive coverage. It's really a role model for Ukrainian reforms. So surprisingly, despite even very influential, very powerful Russian anti-Polish propaganda, anti-Western propaganda, and Polish part of it, it doesn't work in Ukraine. I haven't noticed anything like this either in Kharkiv or Odessa. It's really did not influence opinion. Poland is perceived very, very positively, as if there was no, Taras Bulba studied in school and so on. In West Ukraine it's different, of course, because there is memory, very personal memory, I feel, because it's transferred from grandparents to children, and the main narrative is, of course, of humiliation. They did not treat us as human beings. This is a typical response when you ask about Poles. They say so. Whatever. Well, they may have good relations. They go to Poland and they have friends or colleagues or business partners. But still, there's some sort of. If you ask about the past, they have this, very, very, very bad memory. Which is, I notice, it's not recognized properly in Poland. It's main rift in our perceptions. Even Polish intellectuals, technically speaking, they can understand this, but it's not an issue in Poland. It's not as high issue as Volhynia massacre. Even though these things are very interconnected, I believe you cannot understand one event without the other event. You cannot understand, terrorism without, these illegal settlements in and so on. So yes and no. I feel that we learned a lot, and of course there is very, very deep understanding that cooperation is needed. It's kind of strategic decision. in both societies and broadly supported. But still there are some resentments, and it's also a very long story. It would last for years. And we never, personally, from all my experience, I don't believe that we will never fully 100% agree on everything. You know, we still would have some, even if we agree, we still have some yes, but. You know, as professionals, we can agree on almost on everything, on facts. Facts are hard. And of course, it's easy to, no, not easy, but it's possible. But interpretation all the time is ambiguous, and I notice that even with the closest friends, we cannot fully 100% agree on some hot issues. Still, there is this yes, but. Yes, but. There are some nuances, and in nuances, in details, we differ.
And speaking of details, I failed to, of course, introduce our panelists very briefly to the audience. And this is kind of a version of yes, but. Yes, I'm going to start this panel, but I should probably introduce everyone as well. Mykola Rabchuk is joined here on the stage by Pavel Koval, Sławomir Serykovsky, Johannes Petrovsky-Stern, Karolina Vigura, Uyen Blacker, Frank Sisson, and Robert Frost. Again, thank you for your participation. Would anyone like to add to Mykola's comments? Again, about Mark von Hagen's question about have Polish and Ukrainian elites learned anything from this past, and what has been learned, if anything? Johanna?
I will start with a disclaimer. I need to say that I cannot say we, the Ukrainians, or we, the Poles. I have this privilege of not belonging to any part of this conference. Thank you. Number one. Number two, I'm the least politically correct person at Northwestern campus, so I might be saying things that fly in the face of some of the ideas we discussed today. So having said that, I would ask a question to a question, as Jews usually do. Why not? My point is very simple. When we talk about elites who are learning from the experiences of one another, let's say Polish elites and Ukrainian elites, I would like to ask two specific questions. What kind of elites and when? This is an important question whether we look, for example, through the period of 1960s, 1980s in Ukraine and Poland. And if we look, for example, at what is going on in the 1990s and over the last 15 years, we will see important parallels and important differences. There is also a difference between, a major difference between the elites, let's say in Krakow and in Warsaw, and the elites in Lviv and in Kiev. There are different perceptions of how these elites participate in the construction of national narrative, how these elites see themselves and their role in the construction of these narratives, and of course the level of nationalistic discourse, or let's say liberal democratic discourse, also differs in these elites. If you look, for example, at what is going on within the elite, within the groups of intellectuals, I don't know if they can be represented as self-aware elites. In Lviv, let's say Kharkiv, Kiev, and Odessa, in the last 25, 30 years of the Soviet Union, I would say that elites in Kharkiv and Odessa do not care about what Poland and Polish-Ukrainian relations are really about. Elites in Lviv and Kiev are all the time pondering what these relations, Polish-Ukrainian relations, are all about. For Ukrainian elites in Lviv, we can talk about Dashkevich and his circle, Isayevich, and you know, this group of people. They certainly represent the Ukrainian self-aware elite, and they are looking at Poland as at an example of national democratic building of the society and of the state. For people in Kiev, the national building project is secondary, but the survival, cultural survival, and suffering is number one. Their discourse and their conversation, I would say, you know, Vadim Skurativsky, Andrei Biletsky, Yuri Sherbak, and others, for them, what's going on in Ukrainian-Polish dialogue is very much mediated by the Kiev-based perception of Russian literature and poetry. And in Russian literature and poetry, especially among the dissidents, the Polish question is the question of suffering. I can give examples, I would not go into that, but this difference of the perception of the dialogue between national building project and suffering is very important if we talk about the difference of perception by different elites of that question.
To add something for the Polish side, I would say that it's actually very hard to refer to this Piłsudski who was in this question. There was no Giedroyć, but there was Piłsudski, which is very interesting, because it's very hard because with these borders, referring to Piłsudski doesn't really make sense. However, previous borders were a loss of Piłsudski, not a win, of course. But what is interesting is that before Giedroyć, Piłsudski represented the left side of Polish political scene, and on the other side was Endecja. And of course, Endecja originally was pro-Russian for the ethnic Polish country, so with the for a smaller Polish state. What happened after Riga was something which was like a bad compromise between these two philosophies. What is different now is that Piłsudski actually represents rather the right-wing side. Well, one thing is, I'm talking about elites, because I think Piłsudski would be much stronger in the society as more romantic, paternalistic vision of, like, more colonial vision of Poland. That's what I guess. That's what I think how it works in the masses. But as for elites, Piłsudski is rather the patron of the right side, and the Giedroyć is a patron of the left side, or like liberal side. But the truth is that actually Giedroyć rules over entire political scene. I mean, it's very hard to find any efficient alternative to Giedroyć. And Piłsudski rather refers to, I'm talking more about sentiments than about concrete political philosophy or doctrine. Polish foreign policy doctrine begins with Giedroyć. This is the first point of any political doctrine of any party in Poland before last elections. Now we had some new crazy politicians, and this is a bit different thing. But the general consensus has the face of Giedroyć.
If I may add some words. During the presentation, Karina Vigura, I thought that, in fact, Polish approach to Ukraine, it's still governed by two coffins, of course, Piłsudski and Dmowski. In fact, in my opinion, we cannot diverse for left and right wings. We, in fact, should interpret the current approach to Ukraine crisis, particularly in the context of Polish internal policy, in the general line of political discussions from last 100 years. And in fact, we have one interpretation, one approach. It's approach based on the insurrectionary tradition. It's approach based on the Piłsudski tradition, and the second, it's Endek, pro-Russian, and we can't find the different approaches. For example, in Polish right-wing part of political scale. Really interesting was the discussion between columnists of two right-wing weekly w sieci and do rzeczy, which was explained by Karolina Wigura, and we can observe in right part of political scale and also in left part of political scale completely different approaches. For example, part of intellectuals and columnists of right wing will support more critical approach to Ukraine. They will underline historical problems. They will underline. They will ask about today, for example. They will ask about effectivity of Polish-Ukrainian relations, and we will find on the right part of political scale completely different meaning, completely different interpretation of situation, like for example Bronisław Wilstein, which will interpret the situation in the line of uprising tradition, in the line of Piłsudski tradition, solidarity tradition, etc., etc. And it's interesting that the same situation we have, for example, in approach to the Warsaw Uprising, to the Russian imperialism. The same columnist, the same intellectual will parallel support Ukraine, and they will for uprising. The second, and another in Antic tradition will support more critical approach to Warsaw Uprising, more critical approach to Ukraine, and I think that if we want to understand Polish internal discussion about Ukraine today, we should use that cliché, that historical cliché. It could be more effective than, for example, to look for political orientation.
If I can just react to that. I believe we have to state at the very beginning that even the Polish attitude towards the Ukrainians within the last 2 years, so from the beginning of 2013, crisis of the Ukrainian crisis at the end of 2013 until today, it is not a stable space of time. It is also a process. So basically, during the first year of the Ukrainian conflict, you could see a vast consensus in the Polish public sphere, from left to the right, which was articulated in support for Ukrainian democratic revolution. It is interesting, Paweł, by the way, that, for example, the uprising, the word uprising, was actually used in Gazeta Wyborcza and Rzeczpospolita. Equally, this was very interesting. Why it was interesting? For two reasons. First reason is that political debate or public debate in Poland is extremely polarized between what we can call the conservative rightist and leftist liberal, if we would like to generalize like that. So this was a very big surprise, this year of consensus. What was also interesting is that Ukrainian crisis, 2013, 2014, was in Poland the 25th year of Polish democratic, the Polish democracy. And what was here interesting is that after a very critical debate that we had about the Third Republic of Poland in June, July, basically when the anniversaries were there, we had we had this consensus in the debate about Ukraine, and it seemed that everybody from left to the right are wishing Ukrainians one thing: to repeat the Polish success. So even though they were very critical about the Polish the Polish democracy, the democratic system, the economical system, and so on, in the end, eventually they would say, "But we wish the Ukrainians so that they have the same success." And I think it's very interesting. Now I think that much has been changing also in 2015. I haven't done such a vast query in the press periodicals as in the case of the first year, but I do believe that now the polarization is much more visible, but also perhaps because the subject itself has vastly vanished from the public debate. It is not as present as it was for the first year. For the first year of Ukrainian crisis, you really had Ukrainian national colors on the pages of newspapers, and it was on the first side of the dailies for months and months and months. Now, I would just like to also react to Rory's question, and I would also like to ask a counter question. Why should we think that the perception of the elites is so important? I do believe that reconciliation is not about the elites, because it is done by the elites. So the Polish and German elites, for example, have been reconciled for many decades before there was something like a change in both societies. And I do believe it's just the same with the Polish and Ukrainian societies. The elites are completely reconciled. There is no question. The question is about the social awareness. And when we ask about the social perceptions of Ukrainians among the Poles, we have been discussing this after our panel in the morning, and we were trying to describe what the picture of a typical Ukrainian in Polish awareness would be. And I think it would be a patchwork of new knowledge about a society that has changed profoundly, and a society that has now this beautiful generation of young people that are more educated than any other generation. This is something about what Jarosław Hrycak had written and said many times. But on the other hand, you also have this paternalistic thought of Ukrainian nationalists or even fascists. I would like to quote one thing from Rzeczpospolita. This is a centrist rightist daily. One of the commentators has written, "I do know Ukraine very well. It's a beautiful country. It looks like a beautiful girl with hair of the color of wheat. But the problem is the rain. The rain has come and her makeup has faded away." This is something, I would have to check that. This is something that is really, this tells a lot about, yes. This says a lot about the patchwork style of thinking of Ukrainians by Poles. And perhaps one more thing. I also looked in the CEBOS. This is the Center of Research on the Public Opinion in Poland, and it shows that it's very complicated. On one hand, during the 2 years, 2013 and 14, the attitude of Poles towards the Ukrainians has become very good as for the relations between Poland and Ukraine. So many Poles have said, yes, the relations have improved a lot. But as for if we like Ukrainians, the Ukrainians are still one of the least liked group by the Polish society. So this is how complicated it is.
I second this idea. First of all, our problem with what we're saying when we mean elite. And this asymmetric relationship of elites and knowledge. I think that on the one hand, from the Ukrainian side, initially attitudes towards Poland were to a considerable degree influenced by the remnants of the Ukrainian intelligentsia that remained in Western Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora in the very first phases. They knew Polish, they knew Polish culture intimately, and in general they didn't like it. And this was their response. The more they knew about Poland, the less that Poland was liked. Of course, the Poland they didn't like was pre-World War II Poland or World War, and they had a considerable influence. Over time, that influence has, of course, died out, quite literally. And with that, a declining knowledge of Poland. Now, Yaroslav, who was here earlier, also talked about the other Polish influence, the young Ukrainian youth who use Poland as a bridge to the West. And that influence has declined. So the two major areas where people intimately knew Polish, literature, music, culture, have decreased. And that has in some ways improved the situation. On the other hand, from the first of those influences, because then you get people having real contact among each other. Then as far as other diasporas, in the Polish diaspora that I know, sorry for this sort of, but that's the world I knew, you might call it the Maslow-Soyuz complex. If you asked most Poles after World War II, whichever emigration they came from, no, we don't like Ukrainians, yes, they were horrible during World War II, why can they organize so well compared to us, right? They ran Maslow-Soyuz beautifully, and here they go organize Harvard Institute and a bunch of these things. Whereas we Poles, argue and fight and whatever. And I mean,
and kredytівka.
And kredytívka.
They still
And they know
are
how to do kredytívka.
Yes, in New York they
So
still
if
go
you
to Ukrainian
ask-
kredytívka.
The other thing I found very influenced with particularly Polish intelligentsia and romantic traditions was the total misunderstanding of the difference between Ukrainians and Lithuanians. That is, the average Polish intelligent would come from Poland with very pro-Lithuanian attitudes. And then he would meet a Lithuanian in Chicago. And compared to the very pleasant Galician Ukrainians who talked with him about Mickiewicz and talked in Polish and dealt with all kinds of things, the Lithuanian was like a solid wall, as if the Pole didn't exist. So you also have these stereotypes that intelligentsias and elites only after 1989, 91, when you had real contacts with the countries, began to change. And I think that has made a great difference. So I think by now, the other are elite and the rest of the population. I think we overestimate the degree, particularly that we have any influence. And so to go to our most drastic theme, it was generally thought by the Ukrainian government that it could manage Polish-Ukrainian relations. We heard about the cemetery in Lviv, the Orlenta cemetery, when very carefully the Ukrainian government didn't allow local people to come to the event. Right? They invited the Poles came, you were kept out. Much of the local population, they did it. They checked their list, reconciliation, we did this and this and this.
It's not true. It's talking about Volhynia. It was allowed.
No, it was not allowed, and Boris Kudziak didn't get an invitation except from the Polish side. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I
Yes.
disagree with this.
Yeah, okay.
Very solid grounds.
Yeah, okay. So
This is wrong interpretation.
many local people did not have a say, but in general, the attitudes of much of the local Lviv population at that time was not taken in, because East Kiev had made a decision. Because there are not two, but many Ukrainians, I would say, but very different attitudes. And I would say, in another way, the attitude that somehow the elite decided how the population would deal with UPA and Bandera and these events. As if you could, from some intellectual elite or central headquarters, decide these things, when much of the population had their experience and had their voice. And that voice is, I think, even stronger in Poland, where you have a much more united society and culture, and people don't pay attention to wider segments of Polish population's opinion. And maybe disagree later on this. Yeah.
I feel a little bit like the tail end Charlie here, the rear gunner. I'm a historian who deals with times long ago, and my knowledge of modern Polish or Ukrainian elites is small. I once got phoned up by the Sun newspaper who said, "Can you comment on the elections in Poland?" And I said, "What elections?" Which was not a good start. I said, "I can tell you about the elections of 1658, but you're probably not interested in that." So, no, the Sun was not interested in that. So I'm slightly at a loss as to what to say, but it struck me two things about my contact with Polish elites, and they're to do with an analogy that has come up today more than once, which is to do with the relations between Poles and Germans. So let me tell the two stories. In 1997, I went on a trip around Poland with the director and his assistant of the Landesmuseum in Münster for the great European Union-funded exhibition on the 350th anniversary of the Peace of Westphalia. It was to look to get exhibits from Eastern Europe. And we ended up in Wrocław, where we had a conversation with the director of the town museum. It was an interesting conversation because he spoke very good German, and I was sitting there listening to this. And he talked about the museum, and he talked about Wrocław, and he talked about the 30 Years' War. And then suddenly he started getting agitated, and his German started breaking down, and he turned to me and asked to translate into German what he was saying in Polish. And he was saying, "The people here in Wrocław, they don't understand what this city is." I thought, we're going interesting places here. He said, "They get fed all this Polish nationalist shite." Wait a minute, sorry, is that allowed on the on the feed?
Absolutely.
He said, "They do not realize that marble from round here built Berlin." And he started reeling off a list of the German inhabitants of Breslau in the past. And I thought, this is really interesting. And what he was a local patriot who was talking about the history of his region. And he wasn't concerned about what he called that Polish nationalist shite they get taught in schools. And I found that interesting because I've done quite a lot of work in what was Royal Prussia, Polish Prussia. I have very good contacts with the University of Toruń. And I've been very impressed at the way that the Polish-speaking elites after 1945 took on that German heritage, which was there. The institutions were German, the libraries were German, and they looked after it. And they promoted it as their history in a local sense. Now, the whole history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as I said in my speech, the union worked because it was a decentralized system from the start, and local patriotism played an enormous part. And for a long time, that local patriotism was not about conflict and violence. I once gave a talk in the Polish consulate in New York, and I was meant to comment on the 10-minute film on Polish history that's done by computer generation. Some of you may have seen it, which is all about fire and war. It starts with Casimir III off to Kiev, burning Kiev. And then the boys are off somewhere else, and somewhere else burns. And then there's the Second World War, and everything burns. And then the Solidarity, and that's burning too. And I said, wait a minute. What your system, what your part of Europe is about negotiation and peace. The German-Polish border was the most stable border in Europe from the 15th century until certain things happened in World War I. The border between Poland and Prussia set at Mielno, the Peace of Mielno in 1422, survived until 1919. That's pretty good going, especially in this part of Europe. And that care for that local heritage, that local patriotism, is evident throughout the lands recovered from Germany, shall we call them, in 1945. I was astonished, to give my second and final story, to go to the reenactment of the Battle of Grunwald, Tannenberg, Żalgiris, whatever you want to call it, in 2010. And we took the children and we drove out. We didn't go out to the actual one because tickets were, all of Poland was attending it and there were no tickets. So we went to the dress rehearsal, which wasn't a dress rehearsal, it was just a rehearsal. It was very hot. And I was astonished at the reaction of those German parts, formerly German parts of Poland. I have a copy of the Kurier Olsztyński, where it talks about our boys, nasze chłopcy, riding out to fight at Grunwald. And they're riding out as Teutonic Knights. They're not riding out as Poles. And it was terrific. And it's full of, these Polish swine that are fighting us. And I thought, this is really interesting. This is fascinating. Now, if you want to get over the similar problems and difficulties, reinvent that local patriotism. Talk about, it's very difficult, given what happened in the 20th century in the eastern borderlands, of where you had all of these divided communities with divided loyalties. It's very difficult after the 20th century to reinvent that local patriotism. But much of the most interesting work I see on places like Lviv, Lvov, Leopolis, Semper Fidelis, Lemberg, whatever you want to call it, is to do with rediscovering that multicultural heritage that includes the Jews, that realizes that Vilnius, that places like Lviv were as much Yiddish speaking as they were Polish speaking. They're Ruthenian speaking. 33% of the Greek Catholics in Lviv, according to the Austrian census of 19 whatever it was, were Polish speaking. Religion, language, we live in a system which venerates migration and multicultural systems and how immigrants can get on with each other. Well, for 400 years, the Polish-Lithuanian Union did pretty well, and the elites that held it to account were the Lithuanians in the 1560s, when Radziwiłł Czarny stands up in the Warsaw Sejm of 1564 and says, you Poles are not obeying the principles of your own political system, which is consensus. We have to agree. You are forcing us into what is servitude because we have to agree to what you're doing to us. And he was right. And the Cossacks, Khmelnytsky, in the mid-17th century, say the same. This is a system that talks about citizenship, brotherhood, fraternitas, and I can't get proper justice from a local court system which is run by Catholics who won't give Orthodox nobles like me justice. Your system is failing, and it's you that are doing it. And the Cossack revolt was as much about that as anything. The Rzeczpospolita down there was failing to live up to its own principles. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Robert. William Blacker.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 points, maybe one referring to something that Pavel said and also following on from what Robert said as well. In terms of the attitudes towards Ukraine and this kind of this problem of polarization in Polish kind of public sphere and public debates, in public debates, I think I find it kind of interesting and sort of puzzling sometimes to observe how that plays out. There are kind of sort of two paradoxes that I often find myself observing in looking at the more, let's say, conservative camp of Polish society and their attitudes towards Ukraine, which at its kind of extreme end starts to come round to, if you look at the website Kresy.pl, which I do on occasion, there's this kind of weird sort of taking on of the sort of Russian propaganda against Ukraine and Bandera and so on, and there's a sort of strange alliance there. On the other hand, and I think even more interesting in some ways, is the way the kind of more progressive liberal camp relates to Ukraine, and it's in this kind of perceived need to take on board the Ukrainian point of view, to understand, to hear the Ukrainian voice, to not let our kind of Polish sort of national prejudices get in the way, which often kind of goes, in some ways it's that sort of gesture, it seems to me that kind of gesture of we are listening to the Ukrainian point of view, sometimes kind of seems to be more important than what the actual content of that point of view is. So you get this, and this has come up in Polish public debates where you get the accusations against the Gazeta Wyborcza and people like Michnik of being kind of in alliance with Ukrainian nationalists, with kind of being over-tolerant of the sort of cult of Bandera and so on in the UPA. I think there is this curious paradox when they're looking at, among that kind of section of the Polish public opinion, looking at those problems in Ukraine, there's this level of tolerance, whereas similar attitudes in their own country would be, it would be something which they would definitely distance themselves from. I mean, where I kind of saw this, or where I sort of started to think about it was actually looking at, because the idea of literature, not history, was looking at the reception of Oksana Zabushko's last novel in Poland, which in the kind of liberal press and Gazeta Wyborcza, you can read numerous articles receiving this novel extremely warmly. And a novel which was criticized by historians like Grzegorz Motyka, for example, or his presentation of the UPA. And I think in some ways, I was sort of puzzled by the willingness to embrace the novel among the kind of more liberal, progressive part of Polish public opinion. Whereas, I was thinking a similar analogous novel about the Armia Krajowa or the Żołnierze Wyklęci would not be received in the same way by those same intellectual circles, I think. So I think there's a certain kind of paradox there, which I think is interesting, and I sort of wonder what people think about that. And the second thing was this idea of sort of local patriotism or this kind of rediscovery of multicultural pasts. One thing I look at in my own research is how this is actually done in both Poland and Ukraine by contemporary writers, and you get actually very, very similar approaches to, you can analyze writers writing about Wrocław in Poland and writers writing about Lviv in Ukraine, and sometimes, some of the things they're saying are really interchangeable, actually. It's very interesting. But I think there are certain differences and certain kind of asymmetries within that, and I think this word asymmetry came up today, which I think is an important one. In terms of that process in Poland, you could name a whole list of books which of contemporary novels which are about these post-German territories, about Wrocław, about Gdańsk. Same sort of dealing with the Jewish past, Poland's Jewish past. It's this huge kind of source of inspiration for contemporary Polish writers. The Ukrainian part, much less so, I think. It's kind of, in some ways, it's a sort of missing part of the jigsaw. There are contemporary Polish writers who do write about this, but at a much, much lower level, in much, much kind of smaller numbers. And in terms of how Ukrainian writers are rediscovering these pasts, I think there's a certain amount of overlap between these writers, actually, and some of them, there is, for example, this publication by Juraj Andruchowicz and Andrzej Stasiuk, which they publish a book together, which is kind of on this topic. So there's a lot of overlap between these writers. But again, there's that sort of Polish-Ukrainian axis is a little bit problematic in among the Ukrainian writers as well. I don't think this is a theme that has not really been fully worked through. There are other aspects of the multicultural past that they're more willing to talk about, and I think that kind of works on both sides among the kind of contemporary writers anyway.
Could I just add a little, on base of that little ride of what I said about the German borderlands? There is a difference, as William has pointed out. Poles have always traditionally had a veneration for German culture that was of the West and took on board a lot of it, a lot more than they suspect sometimes, I think. That's the West, that's developed. Of course, the Poles are in a different position in their own minds, I think, as much as anything else with regard to the East. It's that Polish civilizing that you should be listening to our model, not rejecting it as you did in 1648. So there is a difference, and I would stress that I see that difference.
Before we open up questions to the audience, we do want to include our audience beyond Cambridge and include questions from, of course, my co-moderator, Stanley Bill. Stanley?
Well, we have a tweet here that's for Karolina Wigura, actually, in response to her provocative suggestion that fear of Russia, in fact, could be the basis of authentic relations between Poland and Ukraine. And the tweet says, "It can be the start, it can't be the end." Now, first of all, for Karolina, I would point out that Karolina did make it clear that authenticity, but not necessarily longevity. I'll allow Karolina, of course, to respond to the tweet herself, but then I thought that this provocative question we could perhaps throw open to some other members of the panel. This question of whether the fear of Russia is a significant basis for strong Polish-Ukrainian relations, or a sufficient basis. Karolina.
I think it's a great tweet. Thank you very much.
The tweet, by the way, The tweet, by the way, was from Avi Wolf, just so we have the name.
Thank you, Avi Wolf. But I agree. I mean, I did say a very similar thing in my presentation, saying that it is a guarantee for authenticity, but not necessarily for longevity. And we know it from a very similar situation that we have had in Europe. If it is true that the European project is based on fear of the past, then we know already, after decades of integrating Europe, that that fear is diminishing. It is diminishing for many, many reasons. So, for example, it is diminishing because of the change of the generations. This is normal demographic factor. It is also diminishing because of globalization. So, for example, the Holocaust, that used to be the center of the European culture of memory, has now many, there are also very many other genocides, and cultures different than European tell Europe, well, we don't want to think that the Holocaust is the center of our culture of memory too. We have our own things we would like to commemorate and think about. So this is another reason. There are many more reasons. So basically, we have now an ambivalent situation in Europe where a very strong passion, and fear is one of the strongest passion, is diminishing, and it is leaving a hollow space. Now, this hollow space is being colonized by people who think that fear is a good tool, a political tool, but not necessarily they have democratic and liberal intentions. I mean, for example, populistic parties that are now gaining more and more popularity in France, in Holland, in Finland, perhaps in Poland, we don't know that yet, that perceive immigrants as a threat, and they colonize the hollow space that was left by the fear of the past. They're putting it there, the fear of a stranger instead. So we have a great problem with European identity and European integration, and to say so with the prevailing passion in Europe. And I think the same situation we can have in Polish-Ukrainian relations. If we let ourselves to base only on fear, then within a few decades we'll have the same problem. The fear will somehow diminish. This is a fear of Russia. It is not a fear of ourselves. Yes, in Europe it was more or less a fear of ourselves, what we can do, what atrocities we can do as Germans, as Poles, and etc., etc. Whereas here it would be enough to change the regime in Russia, and the fear would just disappear. So, and then what? What is then the basis? So I believe, yes, it is a start, but not the end. But everything is in our hands, I think. Just last remark. I do believe that reconciliation in politics is not only about values, passions, and interests, but also about economics. 5 years ago, general attitude of German population towards the Poles would be completely different than now. It is now completely different because of the Polish economic success, and I have no doubt about it. The stereotypic polnische Wirtschaft, so a stereotype of badly organized economy and bad organization as such, has changed its meaning. Now polnische Wirtschaft is something very positive in Germany. So I do believe this is difficult to it's difficult to say that, but I do believe the only guarantee of a long-lasting reconciliation between Poland and Ukraine is the Ukrainian economic success, and I wish Ukraine this success very, very much. Thank you.
I want to make 2 points, but before we didn't define what actually we mean by reconciliation. This is very, very blurred word. No, not really, because there were like few definitions floating.
We accepted Carolina's definition.
Okay, good, good. Okay, so I'll go to my point. As Slavko said, that before the Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, we would need to have Ukrainian reconciliation. And here is a very, very big difference between Poland. Here I'm referring to also what Robert Frost said. The very, very big difference that sometimes we forget is that differently than Ukraine, Poland is the most homogeneous country in Europe. And actually it's pretty interesting and unusual phenomenon. We don't have immigrants. We have some Vietnamese, and maybe I don't think that even Ukrainians are coming. They're passing through, I think, but maybe they're coming now. But according to the statistics and the way how we perceive each other, how we are socialized as well, we are socialized as a part of the very, very homogeneous country, which actually makes us pretty disabled when it comes to otherness. It can be pretty problematic when we talk about reconciliation. And the second point would be that most of us are historians, or somehow we deal with the history. So we have this kind of bent, I think. I mean, if Pope will lose his faith, he will lose a good job as well. So this is what happens to us, I think, or to historians. And I'll tell you something which I know from autopsy, because my organization, as it was mentioned, works also in Ukraine. Not because our mission is dedicated to Ukraine, not at all. It's just that we found out that there are Ukrainians that want to do the same thing. We are also in Russia, and good, because especially now that during this conflict, we work as Polish-Ukrainian Russian organization. And actually, it happened 2008 that the people wanted also to create their cultural center, journal. They wanted also to publish books, do exhibitions involved in culture, do similar things that we did at that point. But we don't talk about history. We don't talk about collective remembrance. We don't talk about memory. We don't work even according to this. I don't even feel that there are some sentiments behind it. I think that what is important, and again, this is the first assumption of reconciliation, that there are two sides, that there is division, actually. But this, I think, is a philosophy of the previous generation. I hope, now I'm projecting, I hope that it's partly a diagnosis, but partly a wish, that my generation is a generation of one step ahead, that it's not going to be dialogue anymore, it's not going to be reconciliation anymore, it's going to be like one side. And we share so many similar assumptions, we share so many similar aims, that we don't really need any dialogue. I'm not dialoguing with my friends in Ukraine. We are one camp. It is different with Russia, but because we have very, very different cultural history. And the social capital inside Ukraine, I'm talking about part, of course, Ukraine, not Lviv. I mean, this Ukraine, which was, let's say, this left bank of Dnieper. Social capital there and social capital in Poland, the way how we work, organize each other, the way how we behave socially and collectively is so similar and different in Russia, then it makes a problem when it comes to Russia, but not at all when it comes to Ukraine. So maybe there's not going to be any need for reconciliation on this level between. Maybe we can do this step on. We can move on. Thank you.
Thank you. Johanna?
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly, I would like to address this question about fear. Fear is a concept and a feeling that even cultural historians find difficult to historicize and conceptualize. I would like rather to talk about how Poland and Ukraine and Polish-Ukrainian elites today view Russia and what is going on in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. I believe there is a deeply inserted fear, I'm using it right now, about the historical fate of Ukraine. Many Poles are very well aware of four partitions of Poland, 1772, 1793, 1795, three partitions when Prussia, Austria, and Russia partitioned Poland, and of course the partition of the so-called fourth partition of Poland in September 1939. What happened after August 1991, as the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that the border, the imaginary border between what we call East and what we call West, moved radically eastward. And now this border that separates the imaginary Europe from the imaginary Asia is the eastern border of Ukraine, which implies, which people should have thought about it a couple of years ago, which implies that now Ukraine might undergo, might have the same fate, the same political fate that Poland had in the 18th century, or, God forbid, in the mid-20th century. That is to say, Ukraine becomes an object of partition, and it is very much partitioned ideologically, politically, economically between Russia and the rest of Europe. And that Russia is trying to bite pieces of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk district, and of course the annexation of Crimea, is the beginning, and I hope the end, of that attempt of Russia to partition Ukraine as Russia had partitioned Poland in the 18th century. That creates a shared sense of fear vis-a-vis Russia among the Polish and among the Ukrainian elites. I'm throwing this as an idea. I would like to hear what people think about that. But I discussed this particular situation in Ukraine in the context of Polish partitions of the 18th century, and I got some positive and some positive responses and also some questions. I would like to hear what people think about it.
Yes, let's open the floor to questions, by the way. If anyone else would like to jump in, of course, and address the question of fear, please do so. But let me take some questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
My name is Václav Stezak. I'm just a layman, so thank you for all your inputs, especially from Karolina. So my question is actually inspired by yesterday's films. I would like to just ask you, if we eliminate politicians from the equation of reconciliation, can we make faster and better progress? Because yesterday in the films we saw how normal people could live together, support each other, defended each other against terrible atrocities by politicians. I think politicians are a barrier to progress in reconciliation between nations. So can we make more progress by letting people decide more for themselves about reconciliation rather than leaving it to the politicians, to the so-called elites?
I just want to mention that the films referred to here are Three Stories of Galicia, directed by Ole Onishko and Sara Farhat, and My Friend the Enemy, directed by Wanda Kosha, who is here with us in the audience today. Thank you very much for that question. Would anyone like to take a stab at it? Do politicians matter?
Right? So one thing positive about politicians, those were Polish politicians after 1989. That is, it was after all the Polish political elite at that point. But talking on Ukrainian, but talking about Ukrainian-Polish relations, that is the political elite of Poland at a crucial moment, for whatever reasons, and we can discuss what these reasons were, followed a policy and followed it at least for a number of years that had positive results. So I'm not saying that politicians do not disrail things frequently, but there are times when politics matters. And the other, I would argue, is one of the great mistakes made in Ukraine throughout a number of attempts at reform was for people to become disengaged from politics. That is, we are disappointed with the Orange Revolution, and therefore we don't care what will happen, and therefore in 2010 we don't care what happens with the presidential election. Well, we've all seen the results of that, what it's brought Ukraine. I mean, it was a tragic mistake. Or the assumption that we will only care about the economy, not realizing that without political change it was impossible to bring out
bring out economic change in Ukraine. So we've seen some disastrous disengagements from politics, so that could bring a danger as well.
If I may,
Yes.
two words. We speak about we speak about mistakes of Polish politicians. I think that the problem is in another place. I saw two problems. First, that we lost last many years for an institutionalization of historical dialogue. We should look, for example, for a good example of Polish-Russian dialogue. We worked more effectively on that field. I mean institution. I mean strategic plan. We didn't lose time for action because Polish politicians effectively supported of revolution, of national movement of Ukraine in Orange Revolution. The same situation was during the Euromaidan. And we have problem with strategic plan. The second is really important today. Today in our internal discussion about Ukraine, about Polish Eastern policy in Polish internal circumstances. That we say too much about aid, about support. Maybe it was an element of historical paternalism. We should to propose and to speak to opinion pool about the common program, about the common plan for the future. This is a problem because if you, for example, if you look for Polish television 1 year ago, if you look for the political discussion, practically every politician will said that we will support Ukraine. We will send to Ukraine anything, goods, weapon, and another. And in consequence, we have a real gap. Declaration, official declaration, and not so active work on that field. And the people have in the head that we supported Ukraine and Ukrainians didn't answer. Picture. I had meeting in Rzeszów. One young doctor said, you know, Mr. Kowal, I delivered many years and goods, books, I don't know what, to one school in, let's say, Stanisławów. And asked, and one body of Ukrainian origin painted on the one wall in Przemyśl, Trzyzub. And asked, and what to do? Asked that young doctor. It's a typical misunderstanding. The people think in category to help, to send anything, to aid. And we have problem with imagine that Ukraine will, maybe in future, our main partner. If Ukraine will have success. Because we think about Ukraine and about future of our neighbor only in category of tragedy. This is a problem. And the problem is not a reaction of Polish politicians, because the reaction was really wonderful from all political parties. Kwaśniewski, Kaczyński, Komorowski. It's not a problem. Problem is the plan, and problem is our meaning. our understanding of roles in the common plan for the future. Thank you.
Yes, Carolina.
The question was, if we eliminate politicians, can we have better and faster reconciliation process? I would start from the beginning and say, if we didn't have politicians, we wouldn't have the need to reconcile. This was very well visible in the film Three Stories of Galicia yesterday. And it was also extremely well visible in Pawłokoma, a small village that has become a symbol of Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation in the 2000s. Pawłokoma was a peaceful village where Ukrainians and Poles lived together, and they have lived for decades like this. And it was the politicians or the great politics that have brought division, hatred, and mass killings. And in Pawłokoma, over 300 people, including there is a quarrel about it, whether it was including women and children, but let's say probably yes. They were burned in a church as a revenge after Wołyń. And Pawłokoma is just one example of many villages in today's eastern Poland where this happened. So we can say that the atrocities were caused by the politicians, and this perhaps brings the responsibility of the politicians to start the process of reconciliation. But there is something very deep in this question, I believe, because of this fatigue that we have with reconciliation and declarations of forgiveness and repentance as such. They have been articulated so many times that I don't really think they can influence the social consciousness anymore. For example, in those very famous examples, like the letter of the Polish bishops to the German bishops from 1965, or kneeling of Willy Brandt in Warsaw in 1970, the important thing was the outrage of the societies. So exactly because the Poles were so negatively reacting to the letter of the bishops, of the Polish bishops, exactly that's why we had the beginning of a very deep discussion. A very similar thing in the Willy Brandt's case. Exactly because the society has reacted negatively at the very beginning, there was a chance for a wider discussion. There is no possibility today to repeat any letter and to expect such a reaction, or to kneel anywhere and to expect such a reaction. This is perhaps the reason for which no other politician has done what Willy Brandt has done. This would be only political kitsch, and we need something more.
Little advocem to your question. All of you know this exchange between Tim Snyder and Tony Judd. And Judd actually makes the opposite point and has a very, very interesting and very good argument, which is based on the very illustrative example. Actually, when you follow the history of anti-Semitism, the real tragedy begins when the empires collapses. And then when the masses, when the regular people are entering the scene, then there is a real problem and the real atrocities begun. When you have an empire, when you have a state, when you have politicians, then those groups could negotiate and could defend themselves because there was one actor, or like few at least. When masses are entering the scene, they couldn't defend themselves. So at least when it comes to Jews, the politicians actually played the opposite role, that they saved them as long as they could. Of course, but actually I think the truth is on both sides. Like you can blame them sometimes, you can praise them in other times.
Cool. Yes, actually, Slawomir said what I intended to say, because really I would like to play the role of Advocato Diabolo and to defend politicians, even though I dislike them, usually. I feel that it's wrong dichotomy, wrong opposition between good people and bad politicians. Both of them, both sides could be very bad and very good. So I don't see any regularity here, any iron law. Of course, politicians can manipulate and can misuse popular feelings and so on, but also they can mitigate them and can civilize and gentrify public mood. So it depends. And common folk also is not so good. People are ugly. Not all the time, but very often. So it depends. We have to remember that xenophobia is a biological instinct. It's any creature has it. Not only human beings but also animals. Xenophobia is not about hatred. It's about fear. First of all, it's fear of alien, literally. And it's biological, yes, because everything that is unknown for us evokes some suspicion. It's dangerous. It could be dangerous. So the only way to overcome this basic instinct is to gentrify, to educate, to civilize. And we can do this ourselves through socializing, through knowledge. But also politicians can play a positive role if they, introduce some, culture and education, etc. Because people themselves are not necessarily great. We know we have a lot of evidences, for example, that people in the village, they can protect a couple of Jews from this village because they are our Jews, and especially if they are good artisans, of course they can protect them and hide and so on and help. But at the same time, the same people will go to the other village for pogrom because they are other Jews, they are abstract Jews. There are a lot of such facts. The same people, they operate in different way. Just because of, in this case, they have some social experience and they don't have it in the other case.
Okay,
go ahead, Pavel.
Two sentences. Okay, and in fact, politicians have to have a program and plan. And today, it's a special moment in Polish-Ukrainian relations. We have a special opportunity. And concerning the historical policy, I think that we should establish a special institution and to provide historical dialogue on the special principles, like Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue. We should have money for that institution. We should have a plan for exchanging of young people. We lost time after the Orange Revolution, and we have the second historical opportunity. And we as politicians should use that opportunity. And the second question, in communication with the people, with the voters, we should use the category of benefits. We should discuss about Polish-Ukrainian relations more in the category like in international relations. It could be really fruitful to say to the people, let's today invest money, let's today invest the people, the time of the people, and we'll have benefits in the future. We should start discuss with voters in Poland, with citizens in that category. Thanks.
William?
Yeah, just kind of follow on the discussion of politicians and to come back to this example of Pavel Koma as well, which I think is an important one. I think that the 2008 commemorations, the 65th anniversary of Volyn, were very interesting in the way that Pavel Koma became this kind of symbol of the reconciliation, but in many ways because the politicians decided to go there and kind of make it that way. So you had Yushchenko and Kaczynski go there. So the two politicians who are kind of very active in terms of memory politics, actually, and in many ways quite nationalistic memory politics. Yet going there and making some quite significant progress, arguably, in terms of reconciliation. Then if you fast forward 5 years, 2013, you get a very different atmosphere around the anniversary. And it's interesting to look at who the presidents were at that time. You had Yanukovych and Komorowski, so two presidents who kind of, in different ways, I guess, take a more distanced approach to memory politics. You know, who are not so concerned about them. I mean, we could argue with that. But the kind of the public discourse, the media discourse, was much more, I think, antagonistic around there was much less of a reconciliatory atmosphere around the 70th anniversary of Volyn. I don't know why that might be is a kind of interesting question. I'm sure it's a complicated question. Maybe in part because certain segments of the population in both countries felt that their memories, their visions of the past were not being represented in some ways. Certainly in Ukraine, the Yanukovych effect kind of very much increased the sense of protectiveness of the Ukrainian view of their own past. And when you had Yushchenko in place, there's a sense that, okay, we're being represented now. So kind of removing the political representation of a certain vision of the past can also, I guess, open the way for maybe more polarization in some ways. Robert?
Yeah, you have to distinguish between politicians. Politicians are not a group, there are politicians and politicians. Putin is a politician. Tadeusz Mazowiecki was a politician. They are completely different beasts. And in democratic societies, we know that we sometimes get the politicians we deserve because we ask impossible things of them. We ask them to provide us with the best possible public services without paying any taxes, or paying as few taxes as possible. The Schlachter knew all about that one. So we have to be careful. Politicians in Poland and Ukraine are performing a very difficult task. They have to get elected. They have to play to things that will get them elected. And like politicians everywhere, when they're elected, they've got to think about which of the promises I made that I didn't want to make, that I now don't want to implement. We can see Mr. Cameron doing this at the moment. So we can't just, politicians can help and harm. Where politicians are demagogues or populists and whip up fear, that is something to look at. And on the communities of neighbours living together for years and years, yes, that mechanism is very powerful. I think it's Goebbels, but if it's Himmler, somebody tell me, actually said, yes, of course, we all know a Jew that we want to protect and help because we know him, but we have to be hard. The ones we don't know are from another village. That's something else, because that becomes the other that we demonize and politicians can make play with. Just a quick comment on Russia and the fear thereof. I don't know if people saw there was an interesting opinion poll. I mean, how many people took part in it, I don't know, but the Museum of Polish History conducted on the occasion of the 500th anniversary of the Battle of Orsha, asking, should Poland have been helping our Lithuanian brothers to meet the power of Russia, or should we have been concentrating on the Teutonic Knights and the western borders and getting them back? And it came out 52% saying, yes, we should have been helping our Lithuanian brothers, and 48% saying, no, we should have been recovering the western lands. I found that balance of opinion quite interesting. I don't know what it says. I just throw it into the air to discuss. But I started off by mentioning Putin as a politician who quite clearly is instrumentalizing. We've said today that Russia is so important and massive in this question of Polish-Ukrainian relations. At the moment, that's so obvious, I don't need to say it. But we mustn't go into demonizing all Russians, even though he seems terribly popular. We know there are politicians in Russia who oppose him, and some of us from my generation are older enough to remember what opposing politicians in power in that sort of system can mean for those who oppose him. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. And we know that there are historians in Russia who do not quite take the line that is generally taken. And dialogue with them, I was attending a conference in April in Warsaw organized by Łukasz's Centrum for Polish-Russian Dialogue, my taxi driver taking me to it said, well, that's going to be a short conference, ha. But that is precisely the sort of thing that we need to be doing and reaching out to Russians as well in this dialogue.
Yeah, I'd like to second that, and I'm amazed how successful Putin has been in some ways. We remember his saying that the Swedes, Lithuanians, and Poles wanted to refight the Battle of Poltava, right? That he was able to sell this as a line and turn against Swedish, and the Swedes are not at the moment, however militaristic they may have been in the 17th century. It's been a long time.
Not since Poltava.
Yeah, since Sweden was involved in interventions of this sort. And I think when this issue of fear came up, yes, the way to bring Polish, Ukrainian, I would add Lithuanian, and whatever groups involved in, what has been very, very disheartening is to see how successful the Russian side has been posing this as a certain, if not Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, whatever, paranoia. The Swedes, I don't think, get called paranoia generally in this thing yet. But the inability to reach out. And the only way I see around that is by reaching out to those groups. So Russians and Poles and Ukrainians can do this together. I think that would go a long way to reaching out. And as I think was brought up earlier, Ukraine being this bridge with half Russian-speaking population, or whatever percentage we will see in the future of where it is, it's crucial for Ukraine that somehow on that level of cultural and other affairs there be a reach out to Russia, and it would be very good if Poland were not seen as opposing that, but working with it.
Great, we have time for 2 more questions. Last one I'm going to take if you don't mind, but Alessia, I think you have a question.
I'd like to go back to the point that Serhiy Plokhy made earlier today, that this current war in Ukraine, tragic as it is, could potentially be seen as a chance, an opportunity, and among other things, an opportunity for reconciliation, discussions, dialogues with Poland as well. And we've discussed, or you've mentioned quite a few potential missed opportunities of the Polish politicians, and I'd like to perhaps maybe encourage the discussion of the missed opportunities by the Ukrainian politicians, and I'll stick to the dichotomy. The dichotomy of the sort of society and high politics. So if I can agree with the idea of 2 Ukraines, it'll only be in the sense that there's a state and high politics and the society, and these are very different Ukraines indeed. So they've already mentioned Yushchenko's memory politics. I mean, there was a spectacular U-turn that was extremely harmful towards the end of his term. Yanukovych was simply not interested. He was interested in a different kind of memory politics. So the question really is, the most recent decommunization laws, especially one law in particular, passed by the new regime, is that the first nail or maybe if not the last nail in the coffin of reconciliation with Poland, or the new opportunity for reconciliation?
Would anyone like to take that question? Yes. Yes, go ahead. Łukasz, yeah.
Only short comment, because I think Sławomir's statement requires a short comment. I think we belong to the same generation, and I strongly disagree with the statement that our generation do not need dialogue. I think dialogue, especially historical dialogue about history, is needed from different reasons. But the most important reason is political. Namely, dialogue provoke tensions among public opinions of different countries of our region. As such, it affects also politics, and therefore I would say, demand that dialogue is not needed. I think is quite bizarre for me. Reconciliation, I agree. This term might be interpreted in a different way, and it requires, as you said, and I agree, that there are 2 parties, our party and their parties. And I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on the behalf of, let's say, imaginary Polish party. But dialogue is something different, and I strongly concur Paweł's opinion that also Polish-Ukrainian dialogue needs institutionalization.
Great. Thank you. Sławomir?
No worries. I said that we should move on. I didn't say that we don't need dialogue. Dialogue is the one thing which is in process. No one wants to stop it, even me. I just wanted to do something to add to it, okay? Because dialogue will still preserve two sides. I think there is some field of maneuver. There are not only possibility of making steps back, but I just wanted to express that there is some place ahead of us. That's what I think is important to emphasize.
Mykola, would you like to try to take a stab at answering Olas's question about Ukrainian politicians and these recent history laws? Yes,
it could be interesting. It's a very long story. First of all, I don't think that all those laws were very harmful. Actually, they were very artificially fanned and exaggerated. Both Yushchenko's ukaz, which was meaningless absolutely and didn't affect Ukrainian life in any visible way, and without these repercussions, without all this fuss internationally, it would probably be forgotten next day after this ukaz was issued, or decree. And the same with these laws, actually. Well, laws are a bit different, laws about decommunization. I feel that they are necessary, but of course, as most Ukrainian laws, they are very poorly formulated. That's a big problem, of course. But there were some important amendments already, and all the laws in Ukraine important laws are passing expertise in Venice Commission. So we expect also further amendments from Venice Commission, and which probably also would be approved by the Parliament. So it's not so bad actually as it looks. And the most importantly, I think that unfortunately in Ukraine, many laws are written with sort of predictions that they would not be fully fulfilled. And because of this, everything possible things are put in this bag with a hope that at least something would be fulfilled. So this is a big Ukrainian problem, that laws are not implemented. And because of this, lawmakers, they produce too many laws and too many paragraphs which are a priori obsolete. This is the problem. This is not a country with rule of law, I feel. But again, I don't think that these laws are so bad, and I'm sure that they are necessary. That's another matter how they should be formulated and implemented. That's another issue.
Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our time. I just want to ask our participants to engage in a speed round with me very quickly. We've talked quite a bit about asymmetry between or in Polish-Ukrainian relations. And I was hoping that if you're able, in a sentence or two, to suggest what might be the first step towards a symmetrical relationship between Poland and Ukraine. What would that symmetrical relation look like, and what is the first gesture, first move to get there? This is, of course, putting aside the obvious answer of the cessation of war in Ukraine at the moment, and also putting aside the question of whether actually relations with states are actually ever really symmetrical. But I'm wondering about your suggestions, again, in a sentence or two, starting with Robert Frost, if you have any ideas.
You give us a 3-sentence question, 1-to-1 sentence answer. I'll give you a 1-word answer: respect.
Frank?
What Ukraine will be formed from this war, and that Poland look realistically at what Ukraine is within a year or two, and to find a relationship with that Ukraine, because it's going to be very different from the Ukraine we recently had.
It's very difficult.
You can pass if you wish.
No. Well, I guess I'll say the one thing that comes to mind is I'll be talking tomorrow about cultural literary contexts. So maybe I'll say a little bit about that, cultural politics, cultural policy, maybe. I mean, one thing that you find in the dynamics of cultural exchange between Ukraine and Poland is that it kind of tends to go one way more. I think that let's say writers. Ukrainian writers are more influenced by Polish writers than the other way around. And I think that there's a good way that could be solved, which is if the Ukrainian state, if it ever has the resources, should invest more in advertising itself, promoting its culture abroad, especially in Poland.
And just for the record, that was 2 sentences. William was using a number of commas and semicolons, no full stops. Carolina?
This is really great. I had this remark in my notes, and I didn't know what to do with it. And you just asked the question, and I can say it. I think it would be wrong to use 2 big words. So I think we should resign from brotherhood, solidarity, and forgiveness. Brotherhood, especially because it has 2 sides. Brotherhood is very nice, but also there is elder and younger brother. And it somehow is so that Ukraine is always the younger one, and this doesn't help the relations. So why don't we?
2 separate brothers.
Yes. So why don't we just speak about normality, and we start with this?
Johanna?
I would suggest grassroots, NGO-based forms of cooperation and getting to know one another.
To me, equality means the equal right to make mistakes.
I said a few words about. I think that first, as I say, on the historical field, to pay more attention for real historical problems. It's extremely important for the future to establish maybe only one new institution dedicated especially for the historical for the historical questions, and in consequence to have more time for thinking about future, and about future to think only in category of common benefits. Mm-hmm. Do not speak about aid, do not speak about support, speak about benefits, to have a common plan in a field of economy, for example,